Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 5. I thought that, you've gotten to know me a little bit so that you're ready for the little demon horns and the wig. I didn't want to freak you out the first couple of weeks, but I think you're ready. I think you'll be okay. So, this week, our topic is Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. And a lot of people, are fascinated by Neanderthals because there's a lot out there in popular media. They are fascinating among all the hominins. They're one of the most fascinating ones, and we'll demystify that a little bit this week. So the corresponding chapter for this week is how did Homo sapiens evolve? And I know the title of the chapter makes it seem like it's all about Homo sapiens, which is our species, but there's a lot of material in there about Neanderthals as well, because the coexistence of Homo sapiens and Neanderthals earlier on in the development of Homo sapiens is very interesting. So we will talk a bit about that, and the quiz this week is, you'll see it up on my daylight. It's, as usual, due on the Thursday. And here's a little, I'm trying to remember to put the links for where I get my images here. So some of them are from the textbook. I print screen and I put them in so that we can talk about them as we're going. Some of them are from online. So this is from last week's slide. I reinserted this, and this time I put the link. And it's that hominin tree, just to remember that what we're talking about this week is in the context of what we talked about last week, where we looked at the development of hominins, all these species that includes us, and all our ancestors since that divergence from that common ancestor that we share with chimps and bonobos. So if you recall, or if you go back to those slides from last week, we see that like chimps and bonobos are kind of like in among the living creatures in the world. They're our closest living relatives. But so we have an ancestor that we share with both of them. And since that common ancestor, there have been all these hominins, these ones that you see in this tree. So, starting here with the earlier ones, and moving through time, and this is scale here is in millions of years ago, so probably that earliest one since that split was about 7 million years ago. And last week we spoke in terms of the same terminology the textbook uses, where we have one grouping, our most immediate ancestors from the genus Homo, and we saw that those first ones, like Homo habilis, they started to really, their brain capacity had increased compared to the earlier hominins, and they were able to make tools. And then eventually you come to Homo erectus, where they're starting to control fire. So kind of like the capacity for culture was increasing. But among all these earlier species here, and there's several genera here, that grouping that's above species, these Australopiths, textbook lumps them all together as Australopiths, they were more of, when you hear about that kind of the missing link, and kind of, they're a bit like humans of today, but also a little bit like that ancestor that we share with chimps and bonobos, maybe with some capacity still to climb trees, for example. So we zoomed in on that, and now today we're going to be looking at how we emerged as a species. So our early ancestors from the beginning of the existence of the species that we're a part of, which is Homo sapiens, and Neanderthals, which here are labeled as Homo neanderthalensis. We'll get into that a little bit. And if you ever if you're fascinated by all this, and you're like, well, hey, what about all those other skulls, Jackie? I want to know about those other skulls. It is truly fascinating, but again, this is an intro course, so we're zooming through this part. But I encourage you to take Human Evolution with my colleague Mark Prentice next winter if you're still around. Or if you go to university, you can take a course as an elective in Human Evolution. You'll learn a lot about Denisovans and some of these other really interesting deceased relatives of ours. So Homo sapiens, that's us. Woohoo! Okay, we're the only hominin left living. Okay, so all the other ones are gone, and archaic Homo sapiens, so some of those first ones that emerged, who they were very much like we are today, but there have been changes in our species as well, and in future weeks we'll look at that, largely because of adapting to different places around the world. But they coexisted with other hominins for a while. So when the first Homo sapiens emerged, there were other hominins. So imagine that. Imagine living on a planet where there are other species of people. It's kind of pretty mind-blowing, right? So there are different explanations, and in the textbook they go into this. This is not something you need to stress about knowing, but it's interesting to look at anyway. And I'll go over it, but I know it's very confusing to students at first. So just if you're still confused by this, just don't stress out about it. It's not something we're going to dwell on, but I am putting it there. It's in the textbook, deeper explanation in the textbook. We'll go over it briefly here. So different possible explanations of how Homo sapiens came to be the only remaining species of hominins. In other words, why did we stick around and the others disappeared? How did that happen? So these are the three kind of major explanations. The most popular one, well, it was the most popular one until recently, and so when I started teaching this course back in 2002, this was the most commonly accepted explanation. And like in any science, things change. That tree we looked at on the second slide, after, the first one after the title slide, you saw this tree, right? And the textbook has a different one. And if you look online, hominin trees, hominin family trees, you're going to see a million of them, because different paleoanthropologists don't all agree on what the relationships between these specimens are. And if you're really into this, you're going to get into the whole lumpers versus splitters debate, where some people will find remains of an ancient hominin and say, oh, this is a part of a species that we already knew about. And then some others who maybe they want to make a name for themselves, they'll go, no, they're different. It's clearly a different species, and they're splitters. Like, they'll create new terms for, saying this is a whole other species. And so there's a lot of debate there. Again, like in any science. And if you have a sibling that's younger than you and takes this same course in 10 years, it might be completely different. So it includes this. So, when I started teaching, this was the most commonly accepted explanation, as I mentioned, for why Homo sapiens kind of took over the planet and all the other hominins disappeared. So the replacement model, some people refer to it as the Out of Africa movie. There's a movie called Out of Africa, and so it's sometimes known as the Out of Africa model of human evolution. And what this says is that Homo sapiens evolved on the African continent. Okay, so by the time Homo sapiens emerged, as we know, there were all these other hominin species. Most of them remained on the African continent. Pretty much all the hominins up until Homo erectus remained entirely in different parts of the African continent, coexisting in some places. Homo erectus was the first hominin where they had some groups that migrated out of Africa. I don't like it how they say it in the textbook sometimes, because they'll just say, and I'm doing it here on the slide, but, I specify groups, right? Sometimes they'll say things like Homo erectus migrated out of Africa, which implies that they all left the continent of Africa. And that is inaccurate. So some stayed, and then you had, groups that would migrate, again, over many generations. You couldn't just hop on a plane, pack all your belongings, and go somewhere, right? Migrations took place over generations. So Homo erectus was the first to do that. So here on this little map, there's a question mark here, so it's not clear whether Homo erectus went there, but this darker green, this is the likely range of Homo erectus. This is an older map from a website that had a lot of good tutorials, but this might already be outdated. They might have found some other Homo erectus remains in the meantime. Things change fast in this field. Like, our textbook is probably already outdated. Okay, so that's, so what the replacement model is saying is that Homo sapiens then, at some point, emerged, and again, this is through the process of natural selection that leads to speciation, the creation of a new species. So somewhere on the African continent, they typically say around kind of the eastern side, Homo sapiens evolved, and they spent some time there adapting, and then some groups also migrated out of Africa. And according to this model, what happened is that Homo sapiens wound up replacing these other hominins in the places they encountered, such as Homo erectus in different parts of the world, including on the African continent, Neanderthals in Europe, maybe Denisovans up here further in the north as time went on. So that's what the replacement model is. Homo sapiens emerged in one place through speciation and then kind of spread out and replaced all the other hominins. And we'll talk more about what that might have looked at when we explore the specific case study of Neanderthals a little bit later. Another possible explanation, the second one, which was really popular at some time, but it wasn't as popular as the replacement model or the out of Africa model, is that it's the regional continuity model. And what this implies is that Homo sapiens didn't emerge only in one place. Everywhere where Homo erectus was, and other closely related species to Homo erectus, if you take evolution, you'll learn about Homo ergaster and Homo heidelbergensis, and all these closely related to Homo erectus species that were also kind of out there doing their thing. And so here the idea is that where Homo erectus was and some other species, that Homo sapiens kind of evolved in all those different places kind of at the same time. And some people have claimed to find proof for this because I'll say in living populations today, you can see some things that are similar, like say tooth structure or different things that are similar to, say, the Homo erectus populations that lived there millions of years ago, or the Neanderthals that lived in a certain place millions of years ago. So the idea is that in these different places, these different species evolved into Homo sapiens. Okay? So that one's trickier to wrap our brain around, And today, the prevailing theory is a bit of a blend of both of these things. Because the problem with the out of Africa theory is that it kind of didn't leave room for the possibility of interbreeding between different species of hominins. And for a long time, again, up until maybe 10 years ago, people were denying that there had been interbreeding. They claimed it was impossible. And now there's some genetic evidence emerging for that. So this other model, which the textbook refers to as the African hybridization and replacement model, is a blend of these two other models. So there's an acknowledgement that most of what the out of Africa model says is true, that Homo sapiens emerged in one place, which makes a little bit more sense when you think about how natural selection and speciation works. It's very specific to an environment. So for the same species to just pop up on different places on the planet at the same time, that's kind of fishy. All right? So this is a lot more likely. Homo sapiens, the first Homo sapiens, evolved on the African continent. And eventually some populations migrated out of Africa. Now where the regional model comes in is that they would have interbred with other hominin populations, such as Homo erectus or Neanderthals, and so that explains why there are some genes in the human population today in different parts of the world from those other species. Okay? So again, this is just kind of to make the point that the knowledge is always changing. Who knows, next year, or maybe already, maybe out there's another explanation emerging with things that were just discovered, and it's taking a while to make it into the textbooks. So if you take Human Evolution next winter with Mark Prentice, there might be a whole other thing that we don't know yet. So let's look a little bit about Neanderthals, and that'll help us kind of see where some of those things come in terms of like, well, why did Homo sapiens replace, and that kind of thing. So who are Neanderthals? You have a little map here. This is from your textbook, page 117, and you have sites where Neanderthals were found. So there were, again, when we say migrating out of Africa, it doesn't mean they all left, right? So you do have some remains here. A lot of them are in Europe and kind of Southwest Asia. Again, these are terms we use for these places today. And here you have they put Denisovan on here too. They're kind of related to Neanderthals. They're more recent find. So there were species of Homo, right? So we're still, at this point, talking about that genus Homo that includes, Homo habilis and erectus that we talked about before. And again, with these debates, so there have been a lot of debates. When I started teaching, again, most paleoanthropologists and biologists were claiming that it was impossible for Neanderthals and Homo sapiens to have mated with each other. And now there's with more advanced genetic studies, they're saying actually no, they probably did. There's still in the textbook they define a little bit, things with mitochondrial DNA and all this hardcore genetic stuff that makes it a bit kind of, it's still unclear, but the likelihood is there. So the idea, when we talk about taxonomy, which we started talking about a couple of weeks ago, in these classifications into kingdoms and classes and orders and genera, which is the plural of genus, and species. So those who were saying that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals were very closely related and subspecies of the same species would refer to Neanderthals as Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, which would make them very closely related to Homo sapiens sapiens. All right, so they're in the same species but subspecies. Whereas those who were saying, no, they're two entirely different species and it was impossible for them to interbreed, they would just refer to them as Homo neanderthalensis. So I put question marks because right now these debates are still kind of there, and there's the textbook sidesteps this altogether and just refers to them as Neanderthals. My fear is that when we just call them Neanderthals, we forget that they're also a part of the genus Homo. So anyway, so the first specimen, the reason where their name comes from, if you're curious, the first specimen was found in the Neander Valley in Germany in 1856, and Tal, Thal, is the German word for valley, and in German, th is not pronounced th or the like in English. So sometimes you'll hear Anglophones say Neanderthals because they anglicize everything, but really the original pronunciation is Neanderthal, and I guess because I'm a big fan of the German language, I like to pronounce it the German way, so Neanderthal. Actually, if I was really pronouncing it the German way, it would be Neanderthal, but I say Neanderthal, so kind of a blend, but keeping that German thing of the T pronunciation. Anyway, so that's a bit of background, and again, this map is from your textbook. These are artist reconstructions of what Neanderthals might have looked like, and you see here a comparison between a Neanderthal skull and a human one. And what's interesting, they call this occipital bun here, so their heads were kind of sloped a little bit towards the back. Right here we have this dome shape. Modern humans have this dome-shaped skull, and here's kind of slanted towards the back. You have this brow ridge here that's very prominent, and you see this in these artist reconstructions as well. Neanderthals were actually larger, more robust than Homo sapiens, but they were shorter. So it's kind of short and stocky compared to Homo sapiens, today's human beings. They actually had a larger brain capacity, which is interesting, right? Because last week, one of the things we saw is that over time among hominins, there was an increase in brain capacity. And when you get to the genus Homo, we have these bigger brains, again, relative to our body size, all right? So it doesn't get to the point where we're tipping over because our brains are too big. That would not be adaptive. I can't really think of an environment where that would be adaptive. Maybe if you're always in the water, then it doesn't matter so much, but I digress. I do that. So Neanderthals actually had a larger brain capacity, but as we'll see later on, and they did have some cultural developments that were very interesting, but it wasn't quite like the humans of today, or even the Homo sapiens. So even though they had a larger brain, it's kind of contradictory in a way, because it doesn't mean that they necessarily had the same kind of thinking. Right? But still, as we'll see, they're very interesting species. So, and here we get to these misconceptions about Neanderthals. If you've ever heard Neanderthal in your daily life, it might have been somebody insulting somebody, right? Ugh, they're such a Neanderthal. Stop being such a Neanderthal, right? So there's this misconception that they were kind of dumb and brutish. Sometimes you have that image of the caveman dragging the cave woman by the hair. That's a lot of BS, again, with these ideas that patriarchy is somehow embedded into our genes, and I'll demystify that. We've talked about it before. It's a gross misconception, both about Neanderthals and early humans, but also about gender in general. But there's this misconception that's very pervasive, and some early paleoanthropologists kind of fed into that as well. And again, as I've mentioned before, up to 10 years ago, most anthropologists were maintaining that Homo sapiens had not interbred with Neanderthals. So we'll spend the next couple of slides demystifying that a little bit. I do want to say, so here we have a Neanderthal skull, an image of a Neanderthal skull that was found in France at La Chapelle-aux-Saints. And based on this skull, this scholar Marcelin Boule assumed, because it was one of the earlier ones that they found, and based on the remains of this individual, they kind of reconstructed it and assumed that Neanderthals were all hunched over, kind of like these ones here that you see. And so this is a diorama that was in an American museum in the 30s, where they were kind of basing their idea of what Neanderthals looked like based on Marcelin Boule's analysis of this one set of remains from La Chapelle-aux-Saints. And, you know, that kind of fed into that idea of they're being dumb and brutish and they're hunched over. And it's unfortunate because they're actually really smart. Neanderthals were some of the first hominins to adapt to very cold climates, which means, you know, like Homo erectus, they were also controlling fire. They were able to make warm clothing for themselves. They were able to make dwellings for themselves to protect themselves from the elements. So they were far from dumb. Okay, so if somebody calls you a Neanderthal, take it as a compliment and educate people a little bit about Neanderthals based on what you're learning here or what you go on to learn on your own. So that's unfortunate. And then it's been disproved. What wound up happening, later studies confirmed that this individual that they found actually had arthritis in his spine. And with more advanced kind of genetic studies and different kind of studies that they could do, they were able to tell this. So the reason that this individual was hunched over, that wasn't the case for all Neanderthals. It was this one individual who had arthritis, and he was in his 40s, and, you know, living out in the elements like this, lifespans weren't necessarily as long, but the fact that he was still alive in his 40s despite this condition showed that Neanderthals were actually very social and helping each other out, and that's one of the reasons they were able to survive. So if we talk about Neanderthal culture, here's an image of from page 119 in your textbook, and we're talking about the Mousterian tool tradition. We'll talk about tool traditions again when we talk a bit more about archaeology, so right now we're glossing over them like we did last week with the W21 tradition of the Homo habilis and the Acheulean, I know it sounds like a sneeze, right? Acheulean tradition of Homo erectus. And with Neanderthals, you start to see the Mousterian tradition, which relies a lot on the Levallois technique to prepare cores. And it's too bad that we're not in class at Vanier. We have a collection of replicas. And the Levallois technique requires good thinking skills, because you have a rock and then you're planning where exactly you're going to chip to remove a piece of it. So it requires a lot of manipulation and planning, which I wouldn't be able to do, because I wasn't raised in a context where I was required to, right? So you have a wider range of tools than in the previous traditions. So again, with time, these older traditions, sometimes they would stay static for, say, 1 million years with not much change. And you start to see at this point in our evolution, there's more change, more variety of tools. So this is an important component of Neanderthal culture, specifically material culture, right? The things that people make and use. There's also evidence of them having created hearths, or like these kind of fire pits or fireplaces where you could cook, stay warm. Intentional burial of the dead is also associated with Neanderthals as some of the first to do this, and that sounds kind of trivial, right? But when archaeologists and paleoanthropologists find remains of dead individuals who were buried, they can kind of tell if it was intentional. For example, if the arms are folded up close to the body. They've also found sometimes things buried with people, or flower pollen on graves, which implies that flowers were placed there. And this implies a belief in the afterlife. Sometimes there are practical reasons why people would bury their dead, right? Not to attract predators who would feed on carrion, for example, to avoid smells. But if you're just doing that, you don't need to go to these fancy kind of things, right? You would just kind of bury them, put some dirt on it, or set them off at sea, or burn them or something. which some people do in ritualistic things around the world, right? But this was one indication that scholars have been able to use to say, oh, there's symbolic thinking there, because you need to be able to think symbolically to imagine that there is a soul and that there's an afterlife for that soul. And this is tied into people burying their dead in these intentional ways. Again, collections of bear skulls. A lot of scholars have interpreted this to mean some kind of spiritual system, cave art. All right, there's more cave art associated with Homo sapiens, but there was some associated with Neanderthals as well. And also, there's something in the textbook about how, we talked before about this individual who had arthritis and he was still alive in his 40s. We see evidence of social networks. So for Neanderthals to be able to spread into areas where there were harsher climates because of the cold and stuff, people had to be able to rely on each other, which implies social networks and altruism, and these are cultural traits. Okay? So what happened to these lovely Neanderthals? Well, they're, again, different. There are debates around that connected to what we talked about in the beginning with the different ideas about how Homo sapiens came to be the only ones left. So Neanderthals and Homo sapiens actually coexisted for a period of time. It's different in different places. So like Southwestern Asia, they coexisted in the same territories for up to 45,000 years. It's a heck of a long time. That's way longer than our lifespan spans, right? So we're talking about many, 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 many generations of coexistence. In other places, it was different, sometimes 30,000 years, like maybe in Europe, in different parts of Europe. So sometimes there are people who have assumed, again, people have assumptions about human nature that come out in these kinds of things sometimes, and there have been people who've argued strongly for, well, Homo sapiens, we know we're a warrior species and we like to go take over and stuff like that. So people were assuming for a long time that this is what had happened, that Homo sapiens just kind of exterminated Neanderthals on purpose through warfare or things like that. Given the amount of time and number of generations which they coexisted, that's not really likely. So not many scholars are on board with that idea anymore. There are different ideas. So there's interbreeding. There is some. So this is confusing, right? The textbook is confusing because on one hand there is genetic evidence today in the human population that there's Neanderthal genes in some parts of the world, but there's no. It's confusing because the way they explain it is that you can look at mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down through female lines, and there's no evidence of that. But it doesn't mean that there's no genes that have been passed down at all. So it's kind of still tricky, but it's becoming more and more likely that this happened. So some people are saying that maybe they interbred to the point where Neanderthals just blended into the Homo sapiens population through interbreeding and that they disappeared as a species of their own. They might have simply decreased in numbers as Homo sapiens spread. So as we're going to see in a couple of slides, Homo sapiens cultural capacities were even more developed. So as they were evolving for, say, 100,000 years on the African continent, they were developing their cultural skills. And then when some of them started to spread out, they took that with them, right? So those cultural skills that evolved on the African continent were taken and allowed them to adapt to a lot of different environments in ways that Neanderthals couldn't keep up with. So if you're better adapted, you're getting more of the food, you're getting more of the resources, you're occupying more territory, and Neanderthals may have simply just died out because they couldn't keep up and they couldn't get as much food as what the sapiens were getting. So this is still kind of debated, all right, and who knows if it will ever be settled. Bottom line is, Neanderthals are gone as a species. There are some genes in the population today. I'd love to find out. Oh my god, if I found out I had Neanderthal genes, I'd be like, oh my god, I'm a Neanderthal. I'm exaggerating. But, so anatomically modern humans, which is kind of a fancy schmancy, well, it's not that fancy, I guess, but Homo sapiens that are considered very much like us, so in our species, this, they're human and they're humans like us, emerged around 300,000 years ago. Again, huge time span. They were actually smaller than Neanderthals. So as we mentioned before, Neanderthals were shorter, but they were more robust than humans. So and there was an increased reliance on cultural behavior, so less natural selection pressure. This came out in our conversations on Zoom last week, where people were actually observing that learning about natural selection is interesting. And among humans, we see today that humans can survive today despite maybe not having biological traits that help them adapt to their particular environment. We have all these cultural things like glasses to help us see, medicines to help us live longer, homes that protect us from the elements, clothing that protects us from the elements. If we didn't have clothing, people wouldn't survive in the Arctic, or even in very warm places if you didn't have like something to shelter you, right? So this gave people the ability to adapt to different environments, and Neanderthals did too, right? As we pointed out, they could use fire, they could control their fire, they could build some things, so they were able to survive, say, in northern places like in Europe, like Germany and France during the Ice Age, which is impressive. But Sapiens did even more of that, okay? So when we look at Homo sapiens culture, especially in terms of material culture here, we start to see the development of blade tools and composite tools. So with blades, you have like things that are sharper that might allow you to butcher an animal. Composite tools is when you take, say, a stone tool and attach it to something to make a spear, for example, or anything that has different components. So these images are from your textbook. And other kinds of things, right? Because it's not all about tools to like take care of food. There you see these little artistic things like, little models of, kind of a horse here, a woman, and just different things, some cave art. So you start, again, with Neanderthals. We learned that there were some forms of cave art and other forms of art, but you really start to see a proliferation of that's a hard word, try it or not, of different kinds of art forms, including body decoration like jewelry, which has all kinds of, we know, right, the things that we wear on our bodies, whether they're tattoos, pendants, other kinds of jewelry, painting our skin, they're symbolic, they mean something. So this taps into what we were saying before about abstract thinking and feeling a sense of purpose in the world, a sense of community, right? And that might sound like fluff, like what does this have to do with survival? But as we saw, if people help each other, if people feel a sense of community and they look out for each other, they survive better, okay? So complex art and ritual is related to social bonding, which is definitely adaptive for humans. And it's one of the ways we've been able to adapt to so many places. So here, this is not from the textbook, and I'm disappointed they don't address this. Maybe they do in the language chapter. I don't remember. I'll have to go see. But with our brain capacity and also with our physical anatomical evolution, with our throats the way that they are, with our mouths the way that we are, remember, when Homo erectus was able to control fire, that means we started eating cooked food. And over time, over generations, and eventually with our species, we have smaller jaws and teeth, which allows us to articulate in ways that previous hominins were not. They can make some sounds, but it's very different when you have a big jaw and big teeth. You won't be able to move your mouth the same way. Your throat is different. And again, the brain structure that we have. All this allows for communication through spoken language. And the way that our brains are, that allows us to think symbolically. We'll talk about symbols when we talk about language and communication. It's one of my favorite topics. But for now, this ability to express abstract thoughts, love, hate, tomorrow, yesterday. You can talk about things that are not in front of you. You can plan for the future. You can strategize. You can share knowledge, right? And so this contributed to cultural adaptation, and it helped Homo sapiens spread around the world, right? And it's not that, again, Neanderthals were probably doing a bit of this, even Homo erectus and any other species that wound up, and even those older species that lived entirely on the African continent. This is going on too, and remember, Homo sapiens were also on the African continent, right? A lot of this happened on the African continent. So it's important to remember that, because sometimes people stay stuck in the idea that Africa is this primitive place and that evolution only happened outside of it. Actually, most of our evolution happened on the African continent, and everything after that was just adapting to a whole bunch of different environments. But by the time people were able to do this, they had evolved this complex cultural capacities on the continent of Africa. So, spreading around the world, again, was highly, based on this capacity for symbolic thinking, which led to what we said in the previous slides about developing a wider arsenal of tools, developing art forms, which again, art is not just fluff. It's a big part of our lives, and it helps us feel connected. And when you feel connected, you're going to look out for people and know that they have your backs, and you're working together to survive, which helps everybody. So to end, just to kind of illustrate again, there are fossils of anatomically modern human beings all over the world, right? So again, including the African continent, and so Homo sapiens wound up going all over the place, and there's still kind of a lot of debates about how they got to certain places in the world. So here, like, there have been people in Australia for so long, and there's more and more evidence emerging, scientific evidence emerging, that even before scholars thought people could even make boats to travel these great distances by water, there were people here. Now, Indigenous Australians have their explanations for this, which unfortunately in academia is not always taken seriously. And that's very important, because as anthropologists, we're supposed to respect multiple worldviews. Same thing with the Americas. You probably learned about the Bering Strait theory, and there's a lot of scientific evidence for different waves of migration over a land bridge that once existed, or even by boat. But indigenous peoples on these continents have explanations for where they're from. Sometimes those explanations are compatible with the Bering Strait explanation. Sometimes they're not. This touches on what we said, I think it was last week, when we talked about the idea of evolution, and some people were saying, well, this contradicts the belief we were raised with about, say, the creation story from the Bible, where God created people and animals, and things are the way that they were at creation. And my response to that is similar here, is that you can hold these different kinds of belief in you, and they don't have to be contradictory. So you can believe in science and the scientific explanations, and still have your spiritual beliefs that explain more of the existential kind of, well, why are we here? Who are we? What does it mean to be human? Right? And science doesn't explain that. Right? Science will just explain kind of the mechanics of how things happened, and that can be compatible with any spiritual or religious view. So that's kind of my response to that. I very much, supportive of Indigenous rights to self-determination. We'll talk more about that this semester. It's something that's very important to me and that I work to support. So for me, it is important to acknowledge Indigenous views about where people came from, even if sometimes it seems to contradict the anthropological explanations. Okay? Because I do think that more than one thing can be true. So that's it for this week. I hope that this is making some kind of sense to you. Again, for those of you who like to geek out on things around human evolution and wish you could learn more about these different species, I encourage you to you can read up on this on your own. You can also take a human evolution course where you'll go more into depth and learn more about the way of life of all these different species and the possible relationships between them. It's very fascinating stuff. But in an intro course, it's just, again, it's a buffet. It's meant to give you a bit of a taste for it, and I hope that this is motivating you to learn more. As usual, if you have any questions about this or anything about the course, drop me a line. You know where to find me.